John stood frozen as the bank's screen blinked. Account frozen, unauthorized hold, locking millions meant for veterans in cold digital chains. The sneer of a young banker still echoed in his mind, turning pride to shame. This was no mistake. Something darker was unfolding. But what happened next will shock even those who thought they'd seen everything. But first, let's go back to the beginning. John Mitchell's steps echoed heavily as he crossed the polished floor of Crestwood Bank, his fingers gripping the frayed edges of the checkbook like a lifeline. This wasn't just a piece of paper, it was a testament. Each faded signature, each carefully penciled-in number, a chapter in the story of a man who had survived war and returned home with little fanfare but unshakable pride. The checkbook had seen better days, worn from years tucked away in a drawer, forgotten but never discarded. To John, it symbolized more than mere transactions. It was a record of sacrifice, of quiet battles fought off the battlefield. But behind the teller's counter, Brian's eyes flickered with thinly veiled contempt, his youthful arrogance blinding him to the weight that checkbook carried. "Seriously, sir, do people still use these?" The question was not innocent curiosity, but a derision wrapped in sarcasm. His smirk was the kind that comes from ignorance and a misplaced sense of superiority, fueled by the modern age's obsession with digital efficiency. Brian's world was pixels and apps, not leather-bound ledgers. John's jaw clenched involuntarily. He felt the sting of humiliation sharpen against his skin, not from physical wounds but the bitter pain of being diminished for his past, for the very things that shaped him. Years spent serving in the military, risking life and limb, reduced to a punchline by a man barely old enough to shave. The mockery cut deeper than any bullet ever could. His motivation simmered beneath the surface. This wasn't just about a wire transfer. It was about reclaiming dignity, demanding respect that should have been automatic, a right earned through sweat and sacrifice. Brian, oblivious to the weight of his actions, typed carelessly into the bank's system, triggering an automatic security protocol designed to prevent fraud and misuse. What he didn't realize was that the Pentagon had, moments before, routed millions of dollars into this very account. The funds were earmarked for an ambitious veterans program, a lifeline for thousands relying on housing, healthcare, and employment support. But Brian's flippant handling had locked the account, freezing the entire sum in digital stasis. A cold wall of bureaucratic procedure had slammed down, suspending the aid before it could even begin. Inside the sterile glow of Crestwood's office, red flags blinked unnoticed by Brian, alerts that should have screamed urgency. The bank's security system worked as intended, but its rigid design failed spectacularly in this moment of human consequence. The Pentagon's officials received the baffling news minutes later, scrambling to understand how a critical transaction had hit a dead end inside a small-town bank. Confusion spiraled upward, tensions rising behind closed doors. Every second that money remained inaccessible was a delay to veterans already stretched thin by circumstance. John exited the bank with a slow, deliberate gait, humiliation mingling with helplessness. The door shut behind him like a verdict. He was an unwitting prisoner of the system, a symbol of a larger injustice, one where those who had given everything found themselves mocked, trapped by red tape, and powerless in the face of indifferent institutions. The cold air hit his face as he stood on the sidewalk, the weight of failure heavier than any pack he'd carried in combat. He thought of the men and women who would be waiting, counting on the money to rebuild lives fractured by war. Their hopes tangled up in a bureaucratic nightmare he hadn't bargained for, and now, more than ever, he felt the fire of resolve ignite within him. This was not a setback he could accept silently. The fight wasn't over. This was just the beginning. The moment the news broke, a ripple of outrage swept through the community, swelling quickly into a wave that crashed far beyond Crestwood's modest borders. Reports detailed the scandal with sharp clarity. Millions of Pentagon dollars intended for veterans, frozen by a careless error at a small local bank trapped in bureaucratic limbo. Veteran support groups mobilized immediately, their outrage fueled by the cruel irony of a system designed to protect failing those it was meant to serve. The story was not just about money. It was about respect, dignity, and the tangible difference that funding could make in shattered lives. Headlines ran bold, casting the bank's negligence in harsh light, igniting a firestorm of public scrutiny. John Mitchell found himself unwillingly thrust into the glaring spotlight. This was never a place he sought to be. The quiet life of a veteran, behind the scenes, was his preference. Yet, watching the community he loved teeter on the brink of despair, his anger transformed into action. His personal frustration deepened with every day that passed, his own savings inaccessible, the vital veterans program stalled indefinitely, and the haunting echo of Brian's sneer fresh in his mind. The humiliation he'd endured at the bank wasn't an isolated insult. It was a symbol of systemic failure. He carried not just his own grievances, but the collective pain of countless veterans whose futures now hung in uncertainty. Behind the counter, Brian's youthful arrogance began to erode under mounting pressure. His initial motivation, to impress his superiors and secure his place in the bank's ranks, was quickly overshadowed by panic. The once confident smirk faded as the bank's compliance officers initiated an internal review. Questions came thick and fast, probing every keystroke, every protocol he bypassed. The looming specter of a federal investigation transformed Brian's bravado into desperation. Each passing hour tightened the noose of accountability, and the consequences of his careless mockery crystallized into an unshakable burden. John's response was resolute and unyielding. Empowered by veteran organizations rallying behind him and a sharp-witted lawyer named Melissa Harper, whose reputation for tenacity preceded her, he escalated the fight for justice. Phone calls to Pentagon officials cut through layers of bureaucracy, demanding answers and swift action. Outside the bank, protests grew louder. Veterans and supporters standing shoulder to shoulder, their voices a chorus of defiance against indifference. Social media campaigns harnessed the power of outrage and empathy, turning a local banking blunder into a national call for change. The pressure mounted relentlessly, the stakes higher with every frozen day. Yet, amidst the tension, a fragile ember of hope began to glow. John's struggle struck a chord across the country, resonating deeply in the hearts of those who understood what it meant to be overlooked and undervalued. The public's response transcended anger. Donations poured in, small and large, to aid veterans caught in the crisis. Citizens demanded not only accountability from Crestwood Bank, but also reform from federal agencies charged with safeguarding veterans' welfare. What began as a singular failure sparked a movement, a call to action to rebuild a system that had faltered. John stood at the epicenter of this storm, his pain and persistence fueling a fight far bigger than himself. The frozen funds were more than digits on a screen. They were lifelines. And now, through struggle and solidarity, a path toward justice began to take shape. The fracture lines beneath Crestwood Bank's polished surface had long been invisible to the outside world, until the relentless gaze of investigative journalism exposed their depths. The turning point arrived like a lightning strike, an exposé revealing internal emails laden with Brian's dismissive and mocking remarks about veterans. Not isolated outbursts, but symptomatic of a broader institutional disdain embedded within the bank's culture. The tone, casual and callous, betrayed a systemic failure to honor the very people the bank purported to serve. Words meant to belittle veterans echoed across the digital pages, sparking a firestorm of public outrage that could no longer be contained. The revelation shattered the fragile calm the bank had attempted to maintain. Crestwood's leadership found themselves cornered beneath an unforgiving spotlight, the weight of accountability pressing hard. The once muted voices of veterans, previously muffled by bureaucracy and indifference, now roared with clarity and force. Faced with mounting pressure from federal regulators, public protests, and media scrutiny, The bank issued a formal admission of fault. No longer could they hide behind protocol or technical error. Their failure was personal, institutional, and undeniable. Swift action followed, though it came only after the storm had gathered strength. The frozen account that had held the Pentagon's millions was finally unlocked, releasing funds that had been caught in limbo. These resources, crucial for housing, healthcare, and employment initiatives, began to flow at last to those who had waited too long. Crestwood Bank's public apology was painstakingly crafted and widely broadcast, acknowledging the humiliation inflicted not only upon John Mitchell, but upon all veterans who had been marginalized by negligence and contempt. Brian's fate crystallized under this new reality. No longer the tolerated emblem of careless arrogance, he was reassigned to a position far removed from customer-facing roles. His earlier defiance dissolved under the weight of consequence, a stark reminder that individual attitudes, however youthful or misguided, carried real-world repercussions. The bank's promise to implement comprehensive veteran sensitivity training was more than performative rhetoric. It was a systemic pledge to confront and dismantle the prejudices embedded within its ranks. Simultaneously, security procedures underwent rigorous review and overhaul to prevent any repeat of the catastrophic freeze that had ignited the crisis. At the heart of this tumultuous chapter stood John Mitchell, transformed from a frustrated, humiliated veteran into a symbol of resilience and vindication. The grand opening of the Veterans Community Center, financed by the very funds once trapped behind digital barriers, became a moment of profound catharsis. Standing before a sea of faces, fellow veterans, supporters, and officials, John's voice trembled with the weight of memory as he recounted the journey from mockery and bureaucratic paralysis to justice and renewal. Tears welled unbidden, not solely for the hardships endured, but for the undeniable triumph of dignity restored. His story reverberated far beyond that ceremony, igniting a spark in communities across the nation. It became a clarion call to confront systemic neglect wherever it festered, to refuse complacency in the face of injustice. John's fight demonstrated the power of a single voice raised with unyielding determination, how one man's refusal to be silenced could expose deep flaws and inspire collective change. This was not merely the resolution of a frozen account. It was the reaffirmation of respect, the reclaiming of honor, and the birth of hope for veterans everywhere who had long waited for their service to be truly acknowledged. In this chapter of struggle and redemption, justice was not simply handed down. It was demanded, fought for, and ultimately won. The renewal that followed was both institutional and deeply personal, weaving a new narrative where veterans would no longer be sidelined but celebrated, supported, and empowered. John's journey had etched a permanent mark on that landscape, a testament to resilience's relentless force and the transformative power of standing up when silence seemed easier.